Welcome to the Market Bull podcast, where we dive into the stories shaping Australia's finance, tech, and resources landscape. Each episode, we will be sitting down with ASX-listed executives, industry experts, emerging explorers, and innovators to unpack the latest trends driving investor attention. Whether you're a retail investor, market watcher, or just simply curious about the companies making headlines, this is your place to hear Australia's next generation of growth stories. I'm Matthew Craig, and this is the Market Bull podcast, powered by themarketbull.com.au, your home for small cap coverage. Hi, I'm Matthew Craig, and you're watching the Market Bull podcast. And joining me online today is the Managing Director and CEO of ABX Group, Dr. Mark Cooksey. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Matthew. Great to be with you.
So just for those that don't know about Mark's background, Mark's a highly experienced engineer with over 25 years experience commercialising new technologies in the metallurgical industry, holding a PhD in chemicals and materials engineering. Maybe just give us a brief overview of your background and sort of, what led you here today with ABX Group.
Yeah, sure. So I did engineering at UWA. I got a graduate role with Rio Tinto Aluminium in Melbourne. So it was the late 90s, early 2000s, working on both R&D and helping smelters just improve their processes. So I spent time at the aluminium smelters in Australia and New Zealand. Then I was with CSIRO for 15 years, always in minerals and metals, starting with aluminium and branching out to the others, running the technical and commercial development of new processes. So what new processes are we trying to invent and how do we find investors for it? And then I joined ABX at the beginning of COVID, initially to lead one of our particular projects, which is a fluorine project. And then I became CEO 4 years ago, which brings the bauxite and rare earths as well. And the rare earths is really interesting as well because although it's obviously geology and mining, but metallurgy and chemical engineering is a huge part of the project as well. So it puts me in good stead for this project.
No, absolutely. The timing of ABX, they were incredible. They were ahead of the curve a little bit with this rare earths movement that's picked up again this year, but obviously it started a few years ago, didn't it?
That's right, and give credit to Ian Levy, as our founding CEO, former chief geologist of Western Mining Corporation, and still a director. He was literally stuck at home during COVID, we were unable to progress our bauxite assets, and he, going through his old memory banks and notes and got some evidence to say actually there could be some rare earths associated with our bauxite, and then we were able to screen some of our old data, which of course we'd never assayed for rare earths, and then reassay some samples and then start drilling. So we're able to identify the rare earth resource actually before we'd even done any drilling, which was a real credit to him. And this was all back, 2021, 2022.
Yeah, ahead of the curve, because there's obviously this massive global shift to kind of renewable energy, which has created that huge demand for rare earths. Just why are rare earths so important?
Yeah, fundamentally, it's because, they're used in lots of applications. What's really taken off now is they're used in the high-performance magnets, which are needed for electric motors. And the demand for electric motors is going through the roof, whether that's EVs, wind turbines, or robots, or the military applications. And even though, obviously, rare earths have got some supply issues, both amount and where it comes from, they just make the best magnets. And so that's what's really created this focus on rare earths now.
It's interesting. Obviously, you've got your whole rare earths basket, but kind of not all rare earths are created equal. Those heavy rare earths sometimes can be the real bottleneck. What is the kind of difference between the heavy and light rare earths?
Yeah, it's fairly simple. It's just where they are on the periodic table. So on the periodic table, the rare earths in a line, and the ones at the start are called light, and the ones to the middle and the end are called heavy. They are, I guess they've got more electrons in them. They really are heavier. It's somewhat arbitrary distinction, but then it's coincidental, really, that all the rare earths are found in certain proportions in different ore bodies, and it's a bit coincidental that the demand for the ones that we define as heavy are the ones where there's a shortage. And so that's why those heavy ones are worth more. I mean, it can change over time. I mean, back in the 1970s or 80s, europium was heavily used in cathode ray tubes, and so it was really expensive. And then once they invented LCDs, the demand for europium disappeared, and now it's not worth much. So these things do change, but they change slowly. It's almost like over a decade. You might get a new application, and that's what's happened to the DYTB. As we want these high performance magnets and more of them, suddenly everyone goes, well, it's dysprosium and terbium that deliver that performance, and they're the only alternatives. The price goes up.
So those two are kind of the rarest to find, are they?
Well, it's the combination of they're relatively rare and the demand is highest. So, there's others, I'll even get them wrong, but like lutetium or something where there's even less of that available, but the demand for that's not as high, so it doesn't matter as much. It's dysprosium and terbium, the sweet spot of quite large volume and scarcity, and that's what's both driving the price up, but also just the magnitude of the problem.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously that creates a strong economic forecast of projects, sort of like ABX's. What is the demand forecast set to be for, especially those heavy rare earths?
Yeah, it's obviously we look at it, and to me, forecasting's fraught with danger. What matters to us is the growth rate sufficient to justify new supply and sort of either a little bit of new supply or a lot of new supply. And this was actually the problem back in 2010 when we had the issue the last time China imposed trade restrictions, is that it created a short-term problem, but actually the total demand for rare earths wasn't going up that much. So once the trade issue was resolved, it all went back down, or calmed down again. Whereas now we have this sustained growth in rare earths. I was at a conference about a month ago where one of the leading analysts said, look, even with the EV growth rates being a bit lower than forecast, we can only see the demand for these permanent magnet rare earths continuing to go up. So the way I look at it is whether it's growing at 3% a year or 4% a year or 6% a year, it's growing a lot, and we need new supply. What matters then is to be at the lowest part of the cost curve you can be, such that you're the most likely one to satisfy that new supply.
It's interesting because I mean, you could almost say something similar happened with lithium, obviously a few years back when that boomed with that heavy demand. But obviously then supply was able to, pick up and then kind of outweigh that demand. And we saw what happened with the price there. But it's a little different with your rare earths, isn't it, in terms of the extraction process, and it's probably not as easy, I'd imagine, to pick up that supply.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say that's probably right. I think there's more probably consistency in lithium. There's hard rock and there's brines, but there's, if it works on one project, it can work on quite a lot of others, and so you can bring on new supply. It's more of an economic question and a approval question. Whereas rare earths, I think it's correct to say all the deposits are more different. So it's not a cookie cutter to say, oh well, that worked, let's just build some more of those. It doesn't. It's not quite that easy.
No, and of course, so China, they've kind of had their global dominance over especially the heavy rare earth supply. I believe it's close to 90% of global supply comes out of China. Why is this?
Well, I think so if you go back decades, the West dominated rare earth supply, but at the time, the ones that mattered were things like cerium, lanthanum, which are used in petroleum, europium, I mentioned with TVs, and the hard rock deposits in the West could supply those. When China started getting involved in the 90s and the 2000s, that was probably, and they started really taking over, or the West basically let them say, well, fine, if you guys want to produce them, fine, we'll buy them from you. And it was only about that time that the heavy rare earths became more important. And so the West had really not invested in those at all, had never really had much capacity. China's then going, well, was an opportunity for us, and they were smart enough to identify these ionic clays as a good source of heavy rare earth. And then for 20 years or more, they've developed the expertise and the capacity, and that's why they dominate that section of the market.
Yeah, it's actually something I really was keen to go in depth with you about, that kind of difference between the ionic clays and the hard rock deposits, and why do ionic clays matter, and what's the difference, particularly with extracting those rare earths?
Yeah, it's a complicated topic. I mean, I've spent a fair bit of time in the last few years trying to understand it myself. So, if you take a typical deposit of any ore, it's normally in a what's called a mineral, right? So it's chemically bound. So in the case of rare earths, it might be in monazite. So that's actually a chemical compound of rare earths and phosphorus and oxygen and other stuff as well. And it's a chemical bond, and so you need significant energy or something to break that apart. And that's why you have to use acid or alkaline or high temperatures, because it's hard to break a chemical bond. And that's the same with copper ores and bauxite for aluminium, etc. Ionic clays are completely different. In fact, I don't know if I've ever seen anything like it, where the rare earth is not in a mineral. It's called adsorbed, which basically means attached, loosely attached to a clay particle. So if you go and look at it under a microscope and you say, well, what rare earth mineral is there? There's no mineral. Well, there's no rare earth mineral. It's a clay mineral. But what that means is if you put that into the right sort of salt water, basically part of the salt just swaps places with the rare earth, and you've instantly separated the rare earth from the clay. So you can do, and doing that is just far, far cheaper than having to apply a lot of acid or temperature to a mineral. That's the key difference.
It's obviously far more economically viable, I imagine, then you can have lower grades, but
that's exactly right. Exactly right. So let's pick a good hard rock deposit that might be, I don't know, a few percent rare earths. If you had an ionic deposit of a few percent rare earths, it'd just be unbelievable. Like it'd be so low cost. It'd be a fantastic project. Now, no one's found one of those, or not one of any size. But exactly as you said, the fact that the processing is low cost means that a lower grade is viable. It's a basic combination of grade's only important because it affects cost, and it just means that in the case of Ionic, you've got sort of a different grade can lead to the same overall cost. And sort of broadly speaking, it means a 10 times lower grade of Ionic is roughly equivalent to a hard rock.
Yeah, and of course, so almost like kind of all ionic clays, or most of them, heavy rare earths especially, are in kind of southern China and that Myanmar area. What is the difference? Because I know they've got their technologies that they've been working on for decades now. Just how far ahead are China than kind of the Western supply chains in terms of that technology to extract them?
Well, it's a good. To be honest, I honestly don't really know, and I don't think it's too far because extracting the rare earths from the ionic clay is actually really simple. It's like literally you put it in salt water. I mean, we've done it. We did our initial testing in Ansto, and we still do some, but we've also set up our own capability to do it. I mean, it is trivial. You have a beaker of ammonium sulfate, which is just a salt, with a little stirrer in it, and you put some of the ore in, and in 5 minutes, if you go and assay that solution, 80% of the rare earths will be in it. So I'm sure China has process optimization knowledge, but it's not as if it's not rocket science. I think their expertise is probably more to do with the in situ leaching, where if you've got a hillside and you're pumping ammonium sulfate into it, what's the right rates? How do what's your spacing of injection and all those? It's more about the engineering of it, not actually anything really intrinsic. So I could easily be proved wrong, but I don't think there's a huge learning curve in that particular part of the process.
Oh, that's really interesting. Now, of course, recently the Western supply chains have really looked to pick up their find their own sources of demand, basically, and they're urgently seeking alternatives. And it kind of started with that MP Materials deal that we saw at the end of last year. What did that kind of do to the rare earth market?
Well, yeah, it's sort of, I think, quite a few different effects. So on the one hand, that's good for MP Materials. Without, I haven't read the whole deal in detail, but it looks like, okay, well, getting guaranteed prices and guaranteed offtakes, that's clearly good. It's but it's only part of the market, and the defence demand is actually relatively small compared to the real growth opportunity in EVs and wind turbines and robots. So it's a bit of a market distortion. It's probably yet to see how it really plays out over time. I mean, does the US government and other governments do more deals like that, or do they say, well, actually, we've got our rare earths that we need for our military. The rest of you go and work it out on the market. I know our strategy is to focus on commercial customers, and by that I mean, to me, the most resilient long-term strategy is to have commercial customers that want your product and are prepared to pay the price that is profitable for both of you. If you can get government offtake or support, well, fantastic. That's go for that as well. But I wouldn't want to be dependent on that, because the government changes the policy and suddenly you're a bit stuck. So we've focused more of our effort on finding who are the customers, particularly in the West, that would want to buy our product at a price that is profitable for us.
So we saw a price floor get introduced for neodymium. Do you think that's something that could happen for dysprosium and terbium as well?
Well, I think anything could happen. I feel like the governments are all recognising, look, this is a serious problem, which it is. Like, it's a serious problem. We've got a whole. It's not just the military, right? It's like we've got a whole economy now, effectively becoming more dependent on electric motors and magnets, and we've got a very insecure supply. So governments recognise the risk and are prepared to do something and do something quickly. Where it gets complicated is what to do. and different people within the government and within the industry have different views about what's the right strategy. And there's a bit of self-interest in there as well from, we're all human. So look, I could foresee it happening, but I wouldn't make any predictions. And again, to me, we fundamentally we live in a capitalist society. To me, ABX's best strategy, if we can find customers that are willing to pay a price where we're profitable for, well, that's the most resilient strategy you can come up with. And if you get a bonus on top of that, excellent.
Absolutely. So to your ABX groups, that deep leads Ionic clay deposit that you've got in Tasmania, just take us through this resource and sort of what makes it so valuable.
Yeah, the first one is the metallurgy, and we keep. I mean, even you and I are using this in this discussion. Ionic clay, it's really important to make a distinction between clay hosted and ionic clay. So obviously, over the last few years or several years now, people are saying, "Oh, wow, the Chinese are producing a lot of heavier earths from clay economically. Let's go look for some clays everywhere else. Okay, go look for them." And we found them straight away. Fantastic. So did plenty of other people. And initially I was a bit skeptical because I go, well, I know this metallurgy is really hard, but spoke to ANSTO and they said, well, it's really easy to do a test, do the metallurgical test to see how easily it can be extracted. It's like, okay, sure, we'll send off whatever we did, a couple of dozen samples. And they called me back and said, Mark, these are the best results we've seen. And because for whatever reason, most clays, when you put them in that salt solution, basically not much happens. So what that means is those rare earth particles in that ore are not just attached to the clay particle, they're actually still in a mineral. They're in monazite or something. It's just really fine, so it's sort of in a clay. But fundamentally, metallurgically, they're a hard rock deposit. But they're a low-grade hard rock deposit. because they're 10 times lower grade than the hard rock deposits that are actually mined. So that's the real distinguishing feature. When we did our ASX announcement last week, we actually spent a couple of weeks in advance, knowing the results were coming, really going, let's compare ourselves to all the peers that we can. And we're trying to say, well, who defines what's the definition of a peer? And we decided, look, we think that anything that's not Ionic will struggle to compete on cost, therefore we won't include them. And that left us with only ourselves and three others who've produced an MREC from an Ionic clay. It was the three ASX listed companies with deposits in Brazil. So that's the first differentiating feature, is ours is actually Ionic, which means the cost should be comparable to what's done in China, or can be comparable. If it's not Ionic, you're going to be higher on the cost curve. To me, it's only a question of how much higher. The second feature is the proportion of the heavy rare earths, the dysprosium and terbium and the others, which we talked about already. That's a real bonus. And the third advantage we have is our location, which, being in Tasmania, long history of mining, particularly in northern Tasmania where we are. We're about 10 kilometres from the main highway between Launceston and Burnie. We're less than 50 kilometres to Launceston, where there's labour and engineering. Less than 100 kilometres to the Bell Bay port. So location-wise, it's excellent. In terms of we don't have to build labour camps or infrastructure or anything. And then finally, we also have a bauxite resource co-located with our rare earths, and we've previously mined a different bauxite resource in Tasmania. We know the regulators, we know the communities, so that pathway to approval, if we're smart, can be smoother. So what we say is we have an Ionic clay resource which should be comparable to Chinese, costs, broadly speaking, high and heavy rare earths, or our products worth more, in a location supportive of mining, with hopefully a smoother path to production. We really think that puts us in a unique, and I do think it's a unique position.
No, because I was actually going to ask, so what makes this deposit different? It kind of sounds like, is it fair to say there's not really a deposit like it, as in Australia at least?
I think, we've found none anywhere, because even you go on in an Ionic sense, the Chinese ones and some of the ones in Brazil are similar to ours, are similar to theirs in that you put them in the salt water and you get 60, 70, 80% extraction, at least in a good part of the resource. That's similar, but the underlying geology is different. Again, I'm not the geologist, but most of the Ionic stuff is in tropical environments. Ours is clearly not. So there's something different about our geology, which has led via a different path to an Ionic resource. And Tasmania is known to have different geology. That's partly the reason why it's been a mining area for over a century, because of that unusual geology has led to some fantastic resources in Tasmania.
So just how is the company progressing at Deep Leads?
So when I describe those advantages of our project, the one I didn't say is that it's massive, right? And it's not massive. There's other rare earth Ionic ones even out there that are bigger. But our advantage is lots of heavy rare earths that are in particular demand, and a hopefully and plausibly a quicker path to production. So our focus is how quickly can we get into production profitably, even if that's initially at a small scale or moderate scale. So we're already working with external engineering partners to study the project options. Do you, for example, do tank leach or heap leach or in situ leach, and how big should the project be? And then the metallurgical work is supporting that. We've got column leaching tests underway at Ansto at the moment, and it's focusing on the customers. Again, we've obviously in the last week, or a week ago, supplied the composition of our MREC to lots of potential customers, and we're negotiating with them about how much of a sample we can send to them. because we need their feedback. Do they like our product? How many tons? If a company says, well, we need X many tons of MREC per year, well, our project's got to be that big. And the final bit is the exploration. We're still looking to grow the resource, and like I said, if we're a bit fortunate, we could find an even better area than our best area that we've found today.
So I guess just lastly, so what are the next steps for ABX Group to take that next leap towards production?
Yeah, so it's engineering studies, supported by metallurgical studies, customer engagement, hopefully leading to off-takes, maybe even investment, and exploration to grow the resource and hopefully find even better areas with it to start from.
So it's really just kind of proving the size of the resource a little bit to get that big off-take and assistance.
Well, not even necessarily. In some, it's quite possible that our existing resource is already big enough, certainly to get started. Absolutely. Like I've had some, knowledgeable strategic investor say to me, this is someone with a mining and engineering background who's focused on rare earths, saying, Mark, I think you might already have enough. Why would you do any more exploration? That's one. I'm not saying that's correct, but that's one way of looking at it. So I say, exploration is a complementary activity. We'll still do some. We've got a capable team. It's good to grow the resource, but it's not the prime focus. The prime focus is how can we get a project into production, even if it's at moderate scale, with the resource we've already got.
Well, it's a great time to be in the rare earth sector, that's for sure. Thanks for joining us today, Mark. I know I've learnt plenty. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us, and good luck to you and ABX Group with the next steps in your program.
Great. Thanks, Matthew. Thanks for your time.